Hi everyone, this is Michelle,
And this is Jake.
and today we will be discussing adolescent development and emerging adulthood. So just to provide you with a quick overview of today's discussion, we'll be looking at the neurological functioning as it relates to emotional and cognitive processing, as well as looking at sleep and how it relates to the adolescent brain and biological functioning.
Then we'll talk about how giving behavior is related to social motivations, neurological development, as well as opportunities to contribute, how identity, specifically racial and ethnic identity, relates to distinct but related concepts, and then we'll talk about legal considerations of the adolescent brain, offending behavior, and culpability.
So the Casey et al. Article looks at adolescent risk-taking behavior. So what is adolescence? So the author describes it as a period of time in which individuals act more impulsively, fail to consider long-term consequences, and engage in riskier behaviors than adults. And this is a period where we see increased accidents, suicides, violence, alcohol and drug use, sexually transmitted diseases, and criminal activity. So why do adolescents engage in impulsive and risky acts? Traditionally, it has been suggested that this is a period of development associated with progressively greater efficiency of cognitive control capacities, and that this cognitive control is dependent on the maturation of the prefrontal cortex. So risky behavior in adolescence is linked to a premature prefrontal cortex. And this is shown to continue well into young adulthood. This suggests that there is a linear increase in development from childhood to adulthood. That is, if cognitive control and an immature prefrontal cortex are the basis for some optimal choice behavior alone, then children should look remarkably similar or presumably worse than adolescents, given their less developed prefrontal cortex and cognitive abilities. Yet, suboptimal actions observed during adolescence represents a change in development that is unique from childhood or adulthood. So these traditional explanations for risky behavior that we see in adolescence has failed to account for nonlinear changes during this time. So the Casey et al. Review provides a testable biological conceptualization of the mechanisms underlying these nonlinear changes in behavior. So they propose a neurobiological model of adolescence. And so the researchers propose that risk-taking behavior in adolescence extends beyond the association to prefrontal cortex immaturity. And they propose that subcortical and cortical top-down control regions should be considered together, with subcortical regions developing earlier than the prefrontal control regions. Adolescents are biased more by functionally mature subcortical regions during adolescence compared to children for whom these systems are both still developing and compared with adults for whom these systems are fully mature. This provides a basis for the nonlinear changes and shifts in risky behavior across development due to an earlier maturation of subcortical systems relative to top-down prefrontal control systems. Along with this comes an imbalance between a heightened sensitivity to motivational cues and immature cognitive control. Now, while adolescents are quite capable of making rational decisions and understanding risk and behavior, in emotionally salient situations, subcortical systems will win out over control systems, given their maturity relative to the prefrontal control system. So then the author goes on to discuss two distinct constructs: cognitive impulse control and risk-taking and cessation-seeking behaviors. So cognitive impulse control is an ability to suppress inappropriate actions in favor of goal-directed ones, especially in the presence of compelling incentives. So optimal decisions making requires the control of impulses, and this ability matures in a linear fashion across childhood and adolescence. On the other hand, risk-taking and sensation-seeking behaviors is a desire to seek out novel experiences and taking risks in order to achieve them. And we see a curvilinear pattern with a peak in sensation-seeking behaviors during adolescence, and this declines in adulthood. This suggests a distinct neural system for the construct of risky behavior that is separate from the neural construct for impulse control, with earlier development of risk-taking behavior relative to protracted development in impulse control. So is there an evolutionary perspective as to why the brain is programmed to have this imbalance? Adolescence is seen as a period of gaining independence from the family, increased social interactions, and intensification in novelty seeking, which puts an individual in harm's way. This is an evolutionary feature that individuals need to engage in to find a mate and procreate, and it coincides with the time in which hormones drive adolescents to seek out sexual partners. Then the author provides support for the neurobiological theory of adolescence. And this is supported by various studies, including neuroimaging methodologies, including MRI, DTI, and fMRI neuroimaging. They also provide studies that assess sensitivity to reward. And just to highlight two of those findings, heightened activation of the ventral striatum in adolescents in anticipation of rewards compared with adults, coupled with less activation in the prefrontal cortex relative to adults. They also found delayed functional connectivity between prefrontal and subcortical regions in adolescents relative to adults. All of these studies they describe on sensitivity to reward support their theory that suggests that differences in adolescent behavior from adults depend on the context of the behavior. In reward-charged situations, subcortical systems involved in detection of reward cues will win out over cortical control systems, given the mature regional development. However, in situations in which reward or emotive cues are not present, cortical control systems are not compromised, leading to more optimal performance. They do suggest that there are individual differences. Some individuals are better than others in their ability to control impulses in the face of highly salient incentives. And an example of this is the marshmallow test that is given to children pretty young. They also describe that maybe these individual differences are due to dopaminergic mesolimbic circuitry and the imbalance in the adolescent brain between cortical and subcortical dopamine systems as it begins to shift towards greater cortical dopamine levels during adolescence. Moving on to the Galvin article, why study sleep disruption in the adolescent brain? So sleep is a basic need. It's implicated in cognitive learning and emotion regulation skills. This may be especially true during adolescence when there is a substantial change in the brain regions that support cognition, learning, and emotion. Sleep loss may be especially detrimental in adolescence. Given the ongoing development of the brain from puberty into the early 20s, sleep loss is particularly concerning for adolescents. Why is it important to investigate how sleep disruption affects the developing brain? The author provides three main reasons. The first, understanding from a neurobiological perspective may help explain maladaptive behavioral changes often observed in children transitioning into adolescence. Two, improving sleep may be a way to treat mental health disorders that emerge in adolescence. The onset of anxiety, depression, and other internalizing disorders increase during this time and coincides with sleep problems. And third, the development neuroscience studies on sleep may contribute to scholarly conversations regarding sleep recommendations for adolescent health policies. So Galvin reviews the relationship between sleep disruption and the human brain across two psychological areas that are also mentioned in the Casey article. This is cognitive control and reward sensitivity, and they look at three neural domains: neural activation, white matter development, and connectivity. They look specifically at sleep duration, disruption, which they define as a combination of sleep duration and sleep quality. Now, sleep duration is defined as the number of hours of sleep, but because the exact number of hours is difficult to measure, a more precise definition would be how long an individual lays in bed. Sleep quality is the extent to which sleep was restful and undisrupted, typically based on the average number of awakenings. What do we know about traditional adolescent sleep patterns? Adolescent sleep varies from roughly about 6 hours in high school seniors to about 8 hours and a half in early adolescence. Sleep decreases about an hour and a half from 6th to 12th grade among American adolescents, and we find very similar trends in other countries. And this is problematic because there is evidence that suggests that we need about roughly 9 to 9.5 hours per night, which is optimal for cognitive performance and emotion regulation. So why does adolescent sleep decline? The author provides two major reasons. The first being psychosocial factors such as socializing, screen time, and studying, which increases the likelihood of less optimal sleep in adolescence. Then biological factors. So biological alterations in our circadian and homeostatic systems as puberty alters the body's internal clock, which makes it harder for adolescents to fall asleep. Further investigating sleep in the brain, they provide research focusing primarily in the adult brain, and they find a few different findings. The first, subcortical brain regions implicated in reward processing become hypersensitized by sleep deprivation and are activated in an exaggerated way when anticipating rewards. Sleep deprivation also affects the brain in other ways. Decreased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is accompanied by poor attentional skills and impaired memory. There is way less research looking at sleep in the adolescent brain, and this may be due to the difficulty given shifts in sleep pressure in youth. But the few that have looked at sleep in adolescence has seen a connection to risky behavior, seeing that teenagers whose sleep was restricted engaged in more risky behavior and made more cognitive errors than their peers whose sleep was not restricted. Here I highlight a few examples, a few findings from studies they mentioned in the brain looking at different circuitries, brain circuitries related to sleep deprivation. So to conclude, based on the Galvin article, the author suggests that there is still lots of gaps in sleep research. There is a lack of research on whether differential sleep patterns among diverse populations have distinct effects on the brain. And there is a lack of information about the link between sleep and other indicators of health. Second, there are a lot of methodological challenges to characterizing sleep and how it's linked to the brain. Sleep is a multidimensional construct that is examined through various methods, and experimenters are limited to the extent to which they can simulate sleep practices in a scanner that retains some semblance of real-life sleep. And they conclude with saying that the field would highly benefit from better communication among sleep researchers and developmental neuroscientists to translate the results of studies looking at sleep in the brain into meaningful outcomes.
Now we'll talk a little bit about the Fellini article. So some major takeaways were that giving behavior in adolescence is motivated by needs for autonomy, identity, and intimacy. The neurological development in adolescence is marked by the development of reward, social cognition, and cognitive control systems, and that opportunities to contribute are important, but also may vary in their risks and benefits. So with regards to each of these points, we're going to look a little bit at motivations for giving behavior, how would they contribute to purpose and generativity, how neurological development in certain systems incentivize, contextualize, and process giving behavior, and how opportunities to contribute may pop up in family, peers, school, and community areas, as well as inequities in these opportunities. In terms of motivations for giving behavior, Fellini highlights autonomy, identity, and intimacy as three areas that incentivize giving. So when we think about autonomy, we think about a balance of agency and communion with others. So it's not just the ability to have self-determination or what you're doing. And one area that we see that is in research on different parenting styles, specifically permissive parenting. Since it's associated with negative outcomes, we understand that it's not just agency that's important for adolescents in terms of their autonomy, but there's also a need for contribution that contributes to psychological well-being. So not just having parents let you do whatever you want, but being involved in familial decision-making. When we think about identity, we think about how it's shaped by social roles, which includes contributions to others. So in this way, giving behavior provides a sense of purpose and generativity, or a desire to be impactful. Finally, with intimacy, we think about how it's forged by an exchange of emotional support. Furthermore, this healthy exchange of emotional support is associated with stable, long-lasting adult relationships. Since we are talking about emerging adulthood, with a lot of this adolescent research, we're concerned not only about how outcomes manifest during adolescence, but also how they predict later functioning in adulthood. Fellini's also talked about the neurological development during adolescence and how it promotes contribution. So we can think about the reward, social cognition, and cognitive control systems. In the reward system, we're talking about the ventral striatum, ventral tegmentum, and septal area. These areas contain many dopamine and opioid receptors, which are associated with more reward seeking. We also want to recognize that during adolescence, there are increased dopamine levels, specifically during puberty, that contribute to this reward-seeking behavior. In the social cognition systems, we're talking about the medial PFC, the temporal parietal junction, and the posterior superior temporal sulcus. This is known as the mentalizing network because it's linked to social perspective taking. And so the development of these areas during adolescence is associated with increased contextual sensitivity, and we also notice flexible activation of these areas in decision-making among adolescents. Finally, in the cognitive control systems, we're looking at the dorsal and lateral PFC as well as the orbital frontal cortex. This system is related to reward-relating processing, so this idea for winning for oneself becomes particularly salient during adolescence and also promotes social giving. So contribution and giving behavior is also associated by a kind of personal benefit, personal reward that adolescents are now able to process. When we think about opportunities to contribute, we're talking about different areas of an adolescent's life. Specifically, Bellini focuses on family, peers, school, and community. Within the family environment, activities such as cleaning, cooking, and sibling care are primary opportunities to contribute. So helping the family by fulfilling these roles can promote psychological well-being because the sense of responsibility can protect against risky behaviors. It's also important to recognize that these instrumental contributions are more common, but also more necessary in families with fewer educational opportunities. And so taking that a step further, high contribution out of necessity, for example, if a parent is ill or if there's parental conflict in the family that prompts parentification of an adolescent, in those situations, we see more of a negative impact on psychological, behavioral, and educational adjustment with this kind of contribution. When we think about the peer environment, we're thinking primarily about pro-social behavior, so providing emotional and instrumental support to one's friends. Such behavior increases during adolescence and is also more common towards peers than it is towards family and strangers. This could be due to a smaller power differential between peers compared to adolescents and their family or their teachers. So this decreased power differential allows for increased agency for adolescents to contribute opinions, fulfill roles within their social group. But on the flip side, there's also a risk of social rejection and social disconnection, which are connected to poor mental and physical health outcomes. In terms of opportunities to contribute in school, student government programs, service learning, and clubs and sports can be robust opportunities for students to contribute to their school community. These opportunities offer responsibility in terms of making decisions around student life, engaging with one's community, fulfilling certain roles, having a membership to a particular group within your school, and having peer impact, especially with things like service learning and clubs and sports. Also, some schools that use a cooperative learning model can encourage collaboration and imbue adolescents with a sense of purpose and goal setting and problem solving. It's important to notice that poorer schools tend to have fewer resources and can provide fewer opportunities to their students, which could contribute to underachievement and dropout rates in schools with fewer resources. When we're talking about community opportunities to contribute, you can think about local organizations such as the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Scouts, as well as religious youth groups. Such programs offer service learning, volunteering, and at times social action opportunities. And employment opportunities with reasonable demands can also have a positive impact as long as these demands don't go beyond what the student has time for and result in them having to compromise other responsibilities, other forms of well-being. Again, in terms of inequities, it's important to recognize that less well-funded organizations may have less time, personnel, and resources to commit to contribution opportunities. So adolescents in poor communities may have less agency, less impact, or fewer outlets in the contribution opportunities they're able to engage in. Now we'll move on to the Lee Williams et al. Article, which talks primarily about racial and ethnic identity. We'll talk a little bit about how these are distinct but related concepts and how they relate to different aspects of adolescent development. And we'll also talk about how youth developmental research would be enhanced by incorporating REI considerations and vice versa. This would look specifically at research on intersections with other social identities and how socio-ecological perspectives can be incorporated into this research for greater clarity. Lee, Williams, and colleagues outline some pretty distinct differences between racial and ethnic identity, while also recognizing that they are very similar concepts. So when it comes to racial identity, we're thinking about it being defined from without, grounded in power or societal oppression, privilege, and racism, so a lot of social forces. Whereas with ethnic identity, it tends to be defined from within, so the in-group members, and reflects shared meaning, norms, values, ways of living, and certain behaviors. Racial identity models conceptualize an identity development based on high or low levels of interrelated dimensions, whereas ethnic identity models conceptualize identity by more of a developmental trajectory based on exploration, commitment, and group affirmation. Finally, racial identity models apply to specific racial groups, whereas ethnic identity models apply to a variety of ethnic groups. When it comes to REI and other aspects of adolescent development, cognitive development and social development play a particular role in the development of racial and ethnic identity. So when it comes to cognitive development, even though it does not develop at the same rate as emotional development, as we've discussed, there is an increase during adolescence. And this increase is associated with increasing complexity of cognitive functioning, which helps with perspective taking, which influences racial identity development. Similarly, increased exploration of ethnic identity is linked to more complex processing of intergroup differences. So there's also a social cognition component here. When it comes to social development, increased exploration of ethnic identity is predicted by increase in same race peers and ethnic centrality. So there's an individual component when it comes to ethnic centrality, the importance of one's ethnic identity through their self-concept, as well as increased engagement with same race peers in a period of greater social interaction. When we think about integrating REI into developmental research, we can think about intersectionality and the socio-ecological perspective. Intersectionality refers to the associations between multiple co-occurring identities. REI and other social identities develop interdependently, but they are hard to study, hard to tease apart because of that reason. Finney suggests that research looking at intersectional identities with REI may require longitudinal data with identity models that may sometimes be incompatible. It's also important to recognize that salience may vary in intersectional identities. So REI salience may be lower if other social identities are more salient. For example, gender, religious affiliation, sexuality, etc. It's also important to notice that strong social identities are generally linked to positive functioning, not just for REI, which is good news. One study looking at cluster analysis found that high centrality of ethnic, religious, family, and national identities were linked to higher positive affect and self-esteem compared to individuals who fell into the low centrality cluster, where none of these social identities were particularly central. So this tells us that closer identification with any of these social identities can improve positive affect and self-esteem, not just for REI. The socio-ecological perspective tells us that context influences REI development. For example, school demographics, school practices, family racial socialization, community norms can impact how one processes and develops their sense of racial and ethnic identity, as well as its salience. So for example, going to a school where you are in the minority may result in a different developmental trajectory with regards to REI compared to if you're going to a school where you're part of the majority in terms of a certain social demographic. It's important to think about the socio-ecological perspective because REI development, although it being an individual process, is also socially related. The relationships between sort of socio-ecological forces and REI are complex, but one thing that we do know is that stability and exploration and group belonging can be protective. So grounding REI research in developmental processes could help to identify mechanisms and clarify independent developmental trajectories so that we have a better idea of how REI changes over adolescence, over the lifespan, and what particular factors play a role in that trajectory. Now we're going to move on to the Bonney and Scott article, which focuses on legal considerations. So, two major takeaways. One is that neuroscience research indicates that the adolescent brain functions differently from the adult brain. And again, we've spoken about sort of the differences in limbic system maturation compared to that of the prefrontal cortex. And this research on neuroscience in adolescence has informed public policy on juvenile justice, but is not yet applicable to specific court proceedings. And the major reason for that is that neuroscience research of this nature focuses on group developmental trajectories, but cannot necessarily be used to compare one individual to another. So with regards to differences between the adolescent brain and the adult brain, as we've discussed, during adolescence, the limbic system maturation outpaces that of the PFC, which results in increased emotional arousal, reward and sensation seeking, and social sensitivity without some of the decision-making processes being up to par to put the brakes on some of this behavior or acceleratory behavior. It's also another key difference is adolescent experimentation with substances. So early onset and severe use predicts later addiction, which is one piece of research that has come out in support of the 21-year-old age limit on alcohol use, because the adolescent brain prior to that may not have the same kind of protections in place to prevent later difficulties due to early substance use. Another area where adolescent research has affected or has sort of drawn distinctions between the adolescent and adult brain is in driving ability and licensing. So it's been suggested that impaired judgment hinders driving ability. Adolescents tend to be more easily distracted and demonstrate a little poor impulse control, partly for the neurological developmental reasons we've discussed. And it's also important to note that substance use, heightened emotions, and distracted driving all play a role in impairing adolescent driving to a greater extent than it might adult driving due to these brain differences. Finally, in terms of public policy implications, neuroscience research suggests that adolescent offending behaviors may be more attributable to developmental processes than antisocial tendencies. So we've discussed this idea of impaired decision making and how it's developmentally normative. So this idea of we all do stupid stuff when we're young actually might hold some water. Also, developmental basis of this kind of offending behavior suggests that adolescents may mature out of their criminal tendencies. So 3 recent Supreme Court cases found that harsher sentences went against the 8th Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment, in large part because the punishments treated these adolescents as if they were adults, as if they were not sort of in these sensitive developmental periods and were likely to change as they grew up. So sentences specifically, such as the death penalty and life without parole, were found to be disproportionate for adolescent offenders who may end up rehabilitating in adulthood developmentally. Research focuses on group developmental trajectories, but cannot yet be used to compare one individual to another. So although these public policy changes have been related to neuroscience research, that same research cannot yet be applied to specific court cases. Individual maturity cannot be established using neuroscience research on group differences. And so we will, in class, use some of these discussion questions. So feel free to read along with them. We have a few bonus ones on the next page. And we look forward to seeing you on Thursday.